Now with that, we're almost done, but there's one additional thing I want to do related to providers. Because I mentioned before that we're now also going to build a provider that depends on other providers. And I'll do this to get this logic here, which we currently have in the build method of my tab screen state, to get this logic here out of this build method. Instead, I want to move this logic here essentially into my filters provider file. And I'll do this by adding another provider here. Because of course you can add multiple providers to the same file. I just typically like to spread them across multiple files to keep things separated. But if multiple providers are closely related to each other, it also makes sense to put them into the same file. And that's exactly what is the case here. Because here I'll add a new provider, which I'll name filtered meals provider. And as the name suggests, here I want to create a provider which returns a list of filtered meals. So in the end, a provider that contains this logic here. And therefore I can already cut this logic and bring it over to filtersprovider.dart. Because here, this provider will now be a simple provider, not a state notifier provider, because I won't create a new filters notifier class or anything like that, but instead a standard provider, which gets this function, which receives a ref, where in this function, I now paste in that code which I copied, where I then want to return this filtered list. But of course, now meals isn't available here, and neither is active filters. So in the end, now this filtered meals provider must depend on both the filters provider, which of course may change because the filters that have been set can be changed. But we also must depend on the meals provider, which indeed will never change, but which in theory could also provide dynamic data. So how can we depend on these providers inside of this provider? Well, by using this ref argument here. Up to this point, whenever we created a provider, we never used this ref argument. We only did that in our widgets. But the ref argument we get here, automatically by Riverpod, is in the end the same ref argument, the same ref object we can use in our widgets. It allows us to read or watch providers. And that's exactly what I want to do here now. Inside of this function, I want to set up a watcher to my meals provider, for example. Now for that, we must import this mealsprovider.dart file from the providers folder. But with it imported, we can set up a watcher. And if you do set up a watcher here, the Riverpod package will make sure that this function here gets re-executed whenever the watched value changes. So that in the end here, you can then return an updated data. And any widgets that would be listening to this provider would then also be updated if one of the dependencies of that provider would update. All of that would happen automatically behind the scenes. So with that here, I get my meals. And now we can do the same for the active filters. Here I can get my active filters by watching my filters provider like this. So this provider here, I'm watching this here, so whenever this changes, this function is re-executed, and therefore the filtered meals are recalculated. Well, and now with this new provider added, a provider which now depends on other providers, which as you see is super easy to implement. But with this provider added, we can now go back to the tabs.dart file, and there, instead of manually getting the meals and the filters provider, we now can get the available meals by using ref, watch, and then here I want to watch my filtered meals provider. So this new provider I just added, which returns this list of meals, this list of filtered meals to be precise. And with that, we moved this filtering logic out of this build method here. This now also means that we can get rid of this meals provider import here, because we're not using anything from this file here anymore. But with all that, if we now save this and restart the app, you will see that if you set some filters here, This still works, and certain values are still filtered out, whilst other meals are still visible. So this app still works as before, but now we're also using a provider that depends on other providers.